Now that we know what choice architecture is and what a nudge is, let's think for a moment about a framework to organize all of the different kinds of nudges that we have come across. There are 4 dimensions on which nudges can be organized. The first dimension is one in which you can categorize nudges by whether they boost self-control or they activate a desired behavior. In the boosting self-control type of nudge, we are typically faced with a situation where the consumer or the individual knows what they need to do, but simply need a nudge to stay committed to that particular behavior. Whereas in the activation kind of nudge, the individual is perhaps not even aware of the right outcome or the right behavior, and so they need to be steered towards that desired behavior. Nudges can also be categorized by whether they are externally imposed or they are self-imposed. Earlier, we talked about consumers that are sophisticates or individuals that are sophisticates. These are people that have a self-control problem and they know that they have a self-control problem. These are the kinds of individuals who might want to impose a nudge on themselves to make sure that they in fact follow through on the chosen action. Externally imposed nudges, on the other hand, might be nudges imposed by some other party. It could be a government, it could be a not-for-profit organization, it could be a think tank, or it could even be a marketing organization. Nudges can also be classified as to whether they are mindful or mindless. We think about a mindful nudge as one that increases cognition and gets people to think more a little bit about the decision at hand. Mindless nudges, on the other hand, go the opposite way. Mindless nudges are effective because the individual typically currently faces too much of a cognitive overload, and so we simply try and make it easy for them to move towards the final outcome by making it easy and getting them to think less about the decision. And finally, another way of classifying nudges is by what we call encouraging nudges versus discouraging nudges. When you think about consumers trying to make the right choice, they can often not make the right choice because something else dominates, some other activity takes up their time, in which case we want to come up with a nudge that discourages that particular competing activity, or we could think of a nudge that encourages the focal activity. Now, when you think about these 4 different dimensions of nudges and put them all together, you will end up with a table or a taxonomy that looks like this. We've got mindful versus mindless, we have encouraging versus discouraging, we have externally imposed versus self-imposed, and we have nudges that activate versus those that boost self-control. In a future section, we're actually going to look at multiple cases and try and fit them in the context of this framework. But for now, let's spend a minute talking about the extreme conditions in this taxonomy. Let's start at the bottom right. A simple nudge where an individual can channel money into a separate bank account to reduce the likelihood that it is spent is a mindless nudge because it makes the decision easy by moving the money into a separate pot. It discourages spending. It is typically self-imposed because the consumer knows that they want to constrain their own spending, and it enhances self-control. On the other hand, a nudge where you can simplify tax rules to make tax filing easier encourages the target behavior, which is filing of taxes. It is externally imposed because typically the tax authorities or the government would actually impose the nudge. It is mindful because it gets the end user to think about the tax decision, and it activates the desired behavior rather than thinking about a particular impulse control or self-control device. Now, just a couple of caveats before we move on. The goal in presenting this framework is to aid in organizing everything we know in terms of cases and examples of previous nudges. By putting together all of these different dimensions into a unifying framework, it helps us develop a ground for a process for designing nudges. And so when we actually go on and think through a process where we look at how to design nudges, we'll keep making references back to this framework. Also keep in mind that different programs could employ multiple nudges, and hence they might span multiple cells or occupy multiple cells in this framework. In the next section, we look at a number of cases and think about how exactly they fit into each of the cells of this particular framework.